Just after World War II, planes like this took off on the first flights of the mass migration by air that would make Australia one of the most diverse nations on Earth.
I've been on board quite a few planes on this journey, but the DC-3 is my favourite. I'm going back in time to a symbolic flight.
1947, Rome to Melbourne, one of the first dedicated migrant flights.
One of the things that became clear at the end of the Second World War was that Australia's population was simply not going to be enough to guarantee that Australians would keep the country for themselves.
Not long after takeoff, they hit a severe electrical storm. The pilot was former war flyer Keith Virtue. We were bombarded by lightning strikes. The two hostesses started praying. I didn't know hosties prayed. And you wouldn't believe it, but in the cabin, the Italians were playing the concertina, singing and having a whale of a time.
And so now it's not purely British migrants who are taken into the country, but pan-European, everywhere across Europe. And it's an extraordinary new departure, and it also builds the Australia that's going to become multicultural Australia.
Despite their wild ride, they landed safely. The first wave of new Australian arrivals by air in a country still overwhelmingly white and British.
Without immigration, we shall not survive.
The Snowy Mountain Scheme and the men behind it are a part of the Australian dream.
Australia was gradually dismantling the White Australia policy, racist immigration laws in place since the founding of the country. The policy's demise coincided with air travel's rise. Flying made the journey quicker and cheaper. It let migrants stay connected with their home countries as never before, and created an Australia of many new beliefs and languages.
Dad was French and Mum was a bit of a mixture, Italian and Spanish, when we migrated to Australia. We had nowhere to live, so I think for about the first couple of months we moved into an army hut. My parents, they could speak quite a few languages. They spoke Arabic, they spoke Greek. When my aunt was around, we all spoke Italian.
Flight crews were often first to meet Australia's new wave of settlers.
I did flights with Turkish migrants and Greek migrants, and they had never been on aircraft before. And you spent your time trying to reassure them without any language. It must have been very frightening for them to be in this sort of situation in very unfamiliar surroundings and not speaking any of the language.
The scale and impact of migration was vast. It made many white Australians uncomfortable.
I think we should stick more to British migrants.
It's the same. I wouldn't like to see the place overrun by all these other nations.
You don't want Japs or anybody else.
But do you think we can afford not to have?
Yes, I do.
Your holiday.
Ciao, I'll see you soon.
Of all the experience and knowledge that migrants brought to their new country, food was often the first to win over local hearts.
Every time a family member arrived from overseas, they always bought cheeses, nuts, delicious food, wine. Back then, the only thing you could get in the pubs was beer. I'd like to think the migrants have certainly made a big difference to the culture and the things that we do.
Most suburbs have at least one delicatessen where you can buy continental-type foods. And a nice pair of Scotch kippers, too.
And in the air, new influences crept in under the alfoil.
Tell us about airline food. Did you notice there were influences from the various countries that you would...
Yes, definitely.
Is it?
There was usually a special that came out of, say, Thailand. You would have a Thai chicken curry, ham and pineapple out of Hawaii. They got a variety, and it usually amounted to either chicken, beef or fish.
So you flew both on the 707 and the 747. Did the meals get a little bit fancier?
Not in economy. No, they got a bit worse, actually.
While millions of migrants flew here, planes would prove vital to another nation-changing movement of people within Australia. Nearly 2 centuries of colonisation had forced most Aboriginal Australians from their home country. But from 1972, wins in the fight for Aboriginal land rights, cultural revival, and shifts by Gough Whitlam's new Labor government gave birth to the Homelands movement. First Australians' long-awaited return to country would be most visible in Arnhem Land.
So the Homelands movement, in some ways, it's a spiritual movement. It's a movement back to country where Aboriginal people have their culture firmly embedded. The challenge, of course, is their remoteness, and that's why the aviation industry becomes so important.
The Homelands movement back in the 70s, 1975, and it happened all around on the territory, to move those Yolngu who were living in the missions back onto their own country.
In their remote homeland near the Arafura swamp, Yingia Goyala and his family hunted crocodiles.
Lots of crocodiles living in the swamp, and crocodile hunters will have to carry the skin. It's about 100 k's walk, like carrying a tractor tire. But that's when aeroplanes came into my life for the crocodiles trading in.
As Aboriginal Australians sought greater autonomy, many Christian missions withdrew from remote communities. But Yolngu encouraged Mission Aviation Fellowship to stay. Their planes were a vital part of Homeland's life. Yingia started as an apprentice mechanic.
I enjoyed it, working on airplanes. People saw me and they said, hey, we got a Yolngu working on airplanes now. And of course they made jokes of me and saying, make sure the nuts are tight, we don't want to fall down from the sky. Then my elder said, push, you must learn, we want to see Yolngu pilot flying airplanes. And I said, no, that's too much. I don't want to be responsible. It took a while, and then I said, okay, then I'll give it a go.
At 24, Yingia took off on his first solo flight.
After I go solo by myself and do a circuit, I was free. And hopefully I get back to the airdrome. Went and come back and land, and it was a big thing to celebrate. I am the first Yolngu pilot in Yolngu land.
As the vast connections made possible by aeroplanes changed lives within Australia, so they altered our experience of war. From 1962 to 73, 60,000 Australians fought communism in Vietnam. Most flew there on commercial aircraft. Among those first to understand Australian soldiers' Vietnam experience were the flight crews that took them to and from the battlefield.
Took boys up, brought men home. When the government of the day in 1950 made a decision to buy jet aircraft, they decided, who do we give the jet aircraft to? Give them to Qantas, and in the event of a war, we'll second Qantas crews. And that's exactly what happened in the Vietnam War.
Qantas sought volunteers to crew the troop-carrying flights. They were dubbed the Skippy Squadron. Today, they march alongside the veterans, an echo of bonds forged in war.
We were all volunteers. My wife was not overly impressed because we'd just had our first child.
The going up flights, the boys were very sombre on board because they're going up to a war zone.
The troops usually flew to Vietnam via Singapore. There, they had the first of many confusing experiences of this war.
A generation after World War II, Singapore once again saw large numbers of Australian troops passing through. But this war was not like the one their fathers fought. The Singapore government didn't want to be seen to be taking sides in the Vietnam conflict. So Qantas had to be very careful when they landed with a plane full of Australian soldiers here to refuel.
The Singapore government didn't want to be seen to be supporting any military involvement in Southeast Asia. So all the troops were issued with multicoloured Hawaiian shirts. And on the transit of Singapore, there'd be 100-odd people get off with hobnail boots, khaki trousers, but funny shirts.
We were a target with 165 troops each way. That was a big contingent to knock out. So the Viet Cong didn't want us to land, really.
We were about 500 foot, 40 seconds from touchdown, and all of a sudden you saw these coloured bullets going past in the screen. And the American controller said, "Qantas, go around, use the other end of the runway. There's a small war going on at your end."
And I lost a brother-in-law in the Vietnam War too. My sister lost her husband, so that was even close. And my nieces and nephews, they grew up without a dad.
For the first time, Australians could watch their men fight on the TV news. Many young Australians questioned the war's justice and resisted the draft. The war and opposition to it would change Australia.
It became the major social issue of its age. Australia was fighting itself on the streets of the major cities over the war in Vietnam as much as our young men were fighting in the jungles and the paddy fields.
Coming out, they were very appreciative to be coming out in one piece, and we tried to make them feel as welcome as possible.
Oh, they were elated to be on board coming out of Saigon at the time, which it was called.
The military decided that the aircraft should be dry, being a military charter. Our captains disagreed. So very often, to carry enough beer, we'd have to block off a toilet and stack slabs of beer in the toilet till they were later consumed.
They were very rowdy. They drank the bar dry.
521 Australians died in the Vietnam War. Over 3,000 wounded. Countless others suffered mental illnesses as a result of the war.
One of my early flights, actually, we came home. I had 165 troops on board and came in over the top of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and that was very emotional. And the boys all got off the aeroplane and kissed the ground, and so did I. We were back on Aussie land.
Defeated, the last Australian troops left Vietnam in 1972. Unlike their fathers and grandfathers, they returned to a nation bitterly divided over the war.
By the late 1970s, nearly 60,000 Vietnamese refugees had settled in Australia. Because of how they escaped Vietnam, they were often called boat people. But almost all came by plane to Australia.
When the UN asked me what country you want to go, I said, Australia.
In my sort of early days of flying is sort of the end of the Vietnam War, so we had a lot of charter flights bringing Vietnamese into Australia.
Oh, it's so exciting. I can't, because it's the first time in my life I fly. So I'm a bit worried, scared and worried and exciting, everything.
But then I think, there's a lot of, in the press, all these people coming into Australia, taking our jobs and sort of, getting welfare. But I didn't see it that way, and I was more than happy to sort of make sure that they were happy and looking forward to coming here.
The war Australia had fought to ward off Asian communism had sparked a new wave of Asian immigration. And return flights would carry a generation newly curious about their nearest neighbours. Nowhere would Australian travellers have more influence than in Indonesia. Guess where I'm going? It might seem un-Australian, but I haven't been to Bali for 30 years. Can't wait. There are over 1 million Australians who holiday there every year, and more than 10,000 Aussies living there permanently. They can't all be wrong. Australia's transformation of Bali began on this beach. At home in the surf here, almost all her life, is Naomi Young.
Hi Naomi. Hi Justine. How are you? I'm well, thanks. How was the surf? Really good. So how long have you been coming here? I first came to Bali with my mum and dad, and I was maybe about 1.5 or 2, so probably 1972. We were staying with friends, I think somewhere in Kuta. They were the iconic, classic hippies from Byron Bay.
Naomi's father, Nat Young, was also a world surfing champion.
Very proud of who my father is. He was a 1966 world champion surfer.
And what was it like? What did it look like then, compared to now?
There was nothing here. Cow paddocks and coconut trees.
Really different.
Really, really nothing.
Nat Young and other Australian surfers discovered the breaks of Bali in 1971. The film Morning of the Earth captured the moment. It was a hit, not just with Australian surfers.
Yeah, so Bali attracted a big surf culture, and surf culture attracted a horde of long-haired Australians. The climate was perfect for growing marijuana, and it was a bit of a party culture, I think.
Through the 70s, the party attracted more and more Australians. Bali became a key stop on the hippie trail, overland London to Australia, that would become a rite of passage for adventurous Aussies. And Australians have kept coming. For nearly 50 years, Bali's tourism industry has shaped itself to their desires. Kuta, a de facto Australian beach, a location with a reputation, a wild frontier, where a colonised nation like Australia has done its own bit of colonising. And fuelling this Aussie invasion is one thing: cheap flights.
265 return.
I've been to Bali, this will be my 13th time.
Be 20, 21 times.
I think Australians almost feel like Bali is part of Australia. It's a bit like Australians with the Gallipoli Peninsula, like that's sort of ours. It's like, no, it's not. We were invading when we were there, and it's not part of our country.
Australians' love affair with Bali has proved as enduring as the wave at Kuta that surfers discovered in 1971. As more Australians took their culture to global destinations,
G'day.
they would also face the challenges
This wicked and cowardly attack
of a connected world. In 1972, Australians took 12 million flights overseas. By the end of the decade, it would be 20 million. For the first time, large numbers of Australians were part of a global community. Its pleasures and dangers.
With blonde hair and blue eyes, and she likes cooking. How about that cover? A real beaut.
Planes allowed people and ideas to move around the world quickly. But in the 70s, airlines were increasingly dealing with a new threat: hijacking. Between 1968 and 1972, at least 130 planes were hijacked in the US alone. Motivated by extreme politics, greed, or madness, it became a worldwide contagion that threatened aviation's growth.
The real development in the 1970s was a shift from a worry about something being wrong with the aeroplane or with the crew who were flying it to being much more concerned about the other passengers on board.
After a single hijacking in 1960, Australia seemed safe. Then, in November 1972, Ansett flight attendant Kay McLaughlin got an unexpected call.
The girl that was crewing this flight to Alice Springs was really ill. She had the flu, and I was called out to go on this trip. We were coming into Alice Springs. We were about 20 minutes out, and it was quite bumpy. And I was going through the cabin collecting last-minute coffee cups and glasses. And I looked up, and out of the toilet came a man, and he was brandishing a sawn-off gun, and he had a big Bowie knife strapped to his waist.
I saw he had a gun pointed at me, and he said, "This is a hijacking."
And he forced us down to the cockpit. He pointed the gun at the captain, at his head, and said, "This is a hijack." And he just said, "I'm at a critical stage of landing and I can't talk to you now. I need you to sit down for landing." So he just backed out of the cockpit and we all sat on the galley floor for landing.
And he was very nervous. He was shaking like that, and I was really worried because he had the safety catch off, and I was thinking, oh my God, I hope he's not going to, have a trigger finger.
Then he got up and went back into the cockpit. He was demanding a light aircraft, and he was saying, "I just want to take my own life and have some excitement on the way."
I found him to be very polite. When we were taxiing around for some hours, it was very hot, and I was just making soft drinks and so on, and he would accept a drink too.
And the passengers really didn't know what was going on. I was able to make an announcement to saying that we were being hijacked and that they had to stay in their seats.
And it seemed like 5 hours. It was only about 2.
At one point, my back was turned and I smelt cigarette smoke. So I snapped around and said, "There's no smoking while the aircraft is on the ground," only to find it was the hijacker. And he had lit up, and my voice must have had such an authority that he almost handed me the gun instead of the cigarette.
The captain negotiated passengers to get off, so he allowed a lot of passengers with bad hearts to get off. So nearly every passenger jumped up. They all had bad hearts.
We opened the back door, and I just happened to be, I think it was because I just happened to be closest to the back door that he took me as a hostage. We jumped out the back door, and he shepherded me over to the light aircraft.
Paul Sanderman was the policeman. He was off duty and he was at the airport.
He got quite close to the hijacker and he made a grab for his gun with both hands, and the hijacker yanked the gun down and shot Paul in the hand.
And then the hijacker kept shooting. I think he shot Paul a couple of times. Paul ran over to the Fokker, but hid behind the wheels.
The hijacker ran off to the side of the runway and he crouched down and then he put the gun under his chin and he took his own life. I felt personally, if I'd stepped onto the light aircraft, I had that feeling that I wouldn't come back. So I did fear for my life at that point. Up until then, I honestly don't think he wanted to hurt anybody.
The crew were just calm and courageous. They were totally unruffled, and I don't want to talk in stereotypes, but, you know, we like to think about Australians being unruffled in this face of actually extreme danger.
Police took months to identify the hijacker. Miloslav Rabinek had lost money in a land deal. His ordinary misfortune and anguish translated into tragedy in the air. In Australia and around the world, new security measures like metal detectors and universal hand luggage searches made hijackings rare by the mid-70s. Flying was safe again, for now. A growing and competitive aviation market spurred airlines to cultivate their brands. A key battleground was the image of their cabin crews.
Around the world, competition between airlines played out as rivalry among their crews, especially as they paraded through the terminal. As enthusiastically as their forebears had participated in world wars and Olympic Games, Australian flight crews took on the world.
I felt proud in all my uniforms. I felt like I was representing Qantas and my country.
It was very glamorous. You know, I was tall and slim, and the minute I got home, I was in front of every mirror prancing around, you know, thinking how good it looked. I thought I might go shopping in this.
Still fits.
Australian aircrew's swagger echoed a wider confidence among outbound passengers on an expanding fleet of Boeing 747s.
Jumbo jets had brought the world to Australia, and in the 1980s, Australia began to reveal itself to the world.
G'day. Now, it's come to my attention that some Americans still don't know where Australia is. Well, I'll tell you exactly where it is.
So in the early 1980s, Australia is coming out of a recession, it's coming out of a drought. Hawke is elected Prime Minister and Australia wins the America's Cup for the very first time.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
And he is kind of really this embodiment of this sort of larrikin nationalism that Australia has often, you know, thought of as being fundamental to their character.
And when someone says, where are you going for your holidays? Say Australia. Oh, and if they say, where's that? Tell them it's where the America's Cup is.
And Paul Hogan, of course, he's coming off the back of Crocodile Dundee. He's also then the face of Australian tourism, particularly to the United States. So all of this is celebrating this idea of a confident Australia, an Australia who is white and male, but very happy to be, you know, this sort of figure of laconic larrikin nationalism.
The new Qantas business class to Australia.
A craze for Australiana took off, and Qantas couldn't resist it. In 1987, they launched a new uniform. It may have been designed by French couturier Yves Saint Laurent, but it was covered in kangaroos.
Can I please have another couple of half dozens, or make it a dozen?
Australia in the 1980s has really liberated itself from any sense of
being contained by a respectable British world. And you can see in, say, all that gregarious, exceptionalist Aussiness.
And there certainly was a different level of presentation with the passengers. In first and business class, people would dress really nicely, and then down the back, shorts and thongs and T-shirts.
In 1989 came the climax of a ripper decade in the skies. Test cricketer David Boone set an unofficial beer drinking record for a flight to London by consuming an alleged 52 cans.
Sporting groups. Some of those flights were horrific, to say the least.
So we used to have a little trick. If they wanted a rum and Coke, we'd put lots of ice, fill it to the brim with Coke, and then just float the rum over the top. So they could smell the alcohol and they would get the first hit of rum, but then it was all Coca-Cola.
The hosts of Australia's 1980s party
All right, J-Man, give it to All right.
were its Labor Prime Minister Bob Hawke and Treasurer Paul Keating. They also presided over economic reforms that would open up to the world Australia's highly protected and struggling economy.
Australia is really opening itself up, and the language and rhetoric that's used by Hawke and Keating is about we have to open up the economy, we have to make our economy global.
Key to Hawke and Keating's reforms was the Accord, a deal between government, bosses and unions to share the pain and the benefits of a more open economy. The Accord was meant to keep wage rises modest. It would face its first big challenge in the air.
In some ways, the country has ground to a halt.
In 1989, Australia's domestic airline pilots sought an almost 30% pay rise. The Accord limited wage increases to 6%. The dispute quickly got nasty.
The pilots were used to winning. They meet Hawke in the 1980s, and it's tough.
For 6 weeks, there was no domestic aircraft flew within Australia.
If you need a comment, you'll have to ring the Federation.
So they had quite a bit of bargaining power because they knew if they weren't there, the planes wouldn't fly.
4 weeks into the dispute, Hawke declared a national emergency. He called in the Air Force to move passengers. And the airlines brought in pilots from overseas.
Bob Hawke calling us a bunch of glorified bus drivers was one of the most damaging statements, I think, that's ever been made, that's seriously had consequences for this industry.
Well, the pilots, they're an interesting breed. And so when you get this dispute in the 1980s, Hawke, who actually plays them at their own game in a way, it actually ends badly for both sides.
The government broke the strike, but almost 1,300 pilots lost their jobs, many going to work overseas.
And I was one of those.
For better or worse, Australia would continue to embrace international markets and connections. Once again, triumph and disaster in the skies would shape the nation on the ground.
The High Court's decision in the Mabo case overturned the 200-year legal assumption that Australia was an empty land.
Among the great changes to Australian life during the 1980s and 90s was the continuing cultural and political revival by Indigenous Australians. Amongst its most prominent signs were works of art like this one by Emily Carr-Noire. It's groundbreaking and fresh as any modern masterpiece while drawing on tens of thousands of years of experience. But not all Australians were ready to acknowledge Indigenous culture and rights.
And once again, a key breakthrough would happen in the air.
2 o'clock one morning, that's when Ros woke me up, said, we've got to put our art on a Qantas plane. And I said, go back to sleep. You know what Qantas is like? It's still a public service type of organisation.
John Moriarty was born at Borroloola in the Northern Territory. When he was 4, the government took him from his family.
You've got to get on with life. You can't allow, too much negativity to control your world.
John went to university and became a successful artist and public servant. He also played football for his country. In 1983, he started Ballaringi Designs with his wife, Ros.
And we felt Australia was grappling with the idea of who are we. So it was a little bit of, how can we get a really big canvas? And so over a period of 18 months, we really talked to whomever we could at Qantas to convince them that this was a good idea. And I think we'd given up that this might ever happen.
But then later on in the year, Ansett started flying to Japan and there was suddenly competition at stake. So sure enough, within a year they have this Wenala Dreaming, this beautiful big red plane with kangaroos all over it, flying into the new Renzo Piano airport in Osaka. And it blew people's minds. They'd never seen anything like it. And it was the most photographed jet for years.
A great mark for us, but with our art coming from the Borroloola, from the kangaroo dreaming aspect that I belong to.
And John always talked about it feeling like a butterfly coming out of that grey sky from a cocoon and landing. I think for our family and John's story, a country that had removed his culture and removed his language, and now to see that same country fly this flagship of such, immense joy was just that antithesis, really, to what had happened to John.
I remember getting onto one of those planes the first time I ever saw it. I had incredible inspiration. I thought, pride. This is an Aboriginal design plane. I couldn't stop looking at it, through the window.
It's often hard to remember that actually when that plane first rolled out, it was quite significant because you didn't see Aboriginal art so publicly on something that was so quintessentially Australian.
4 more Qantas aircraft would become global canvases for Indigenous art. The most recent features the work of Emily Kam Ngware.
It often strikes me when I'm travelling on a plane and I look out the window that actually when you look at the landscape in different parts of the country, it is absolutely phenomenal how much it looks like the Aboriginal art of that country. And you often wonder, how did they know the country when they never flew? And what flying gives us is actually a snapshot into how Aboriginal people understand their country through art. So I always try and look out the window when I'm travelling across Australia.
The art on Australian planes was one of many new ways Australia was connecting globally. In the 90s, Australia continued to open up its economy to a booming but highly competitive world. In 1995, the government privatised Qantas and ended the cosy monopoly that had existed in Australia for 50 years. The result was cheaper flights, but there was a flip side. Market forces were about to be brought to bear on an economically sheltered generation.
Our wages were so good.
If we did a 9-day London trip, we came home and we had 6 clear days off to recover.
You'd go from Honolulu to San Francisco or LA with 40 passengers on a jumbo. And so half the crew would sit down going over and the other would work, and then on the way back, you'd reverse the crew.
That's not the case anymore.
When it was privatised, suddenly planes filled up. I think we were in a state of shock.
We were upset because we loved being part of the government. Also, I think we were letting go of something we didn't want to let go of.
Echoes of air crew's pain resounded all over the nation as the boomers lost many of the perks that had helped make Australia the lucky country. Ansett struggled against increased competition, an ageing fleet and high costs. 16,000 people were out of work when the company went bust in 2001. It was the largest mass job loss in Australian history.
It was the worst week of my life.
And just 2 days before Ansett's demise, events in the skies one clear morning in America would change the course of aviation and world history. On September 11, 2001, I was at home with a 6-week-old baby. All of a sudden, I just felt a lot less safe. Nothing would ever be the same again. And once again, that change was felt first by those that flew.
I was in London.
Coming into Singapore.
I lost people that I knew.
Look, it rattled the whole aviation world.
Mobile phones, keys, change, come on.
Anyone who looked anything remotely like a terrorist was under suspicion, so a lot of innocent people were given a hard time when there was no need to do so.
9/11 spelled out very clearly that the golden age of aviation was over. It happened dramatically. Suddenly commercial planes became weapons, and even that whole promise of the 20th century moving into the 21st century was about the promise of flight and what flight could do, and there was a kind of optimism about it. 9/11 just kind of closed that down instantly.
A year later, terrorists struck much closer to home. They bombed 2 of Bali's heaving night spots, killing 202 people, 88 Australians.
This wicked and cowardly attack, clearly on the evidence available to us, an act of terrorism.
The fallout from that was interesting because it actually told us what Bali means to Australians. So instead of being angry at the Indonesians, which Australians might have been, there was this actually, the anger was just directed towards the terrorism.
In the wake of Bali and 9/11, Australia turned inwards.
We will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
A country transformed by migration was now deeply conflicted about it. And in an era of stop the boats, connections forged by flying would face their greatest challenge.
A travel ban will be placed on all non-residents, non-Australian citizens.
Of all the 21st century Australian relationships underpinned by aviation, one stands out.
On the same day, the new Qantas office opened in Shanghai Centre.
Australia's recent history is a story told increasingly in Chinese. By 2011, Mandarin was the second most spoken Australian language, and China was beginning to rival the US as the Pacific's dominant power.
So China joins the World Trade Organization. China steps into the global economic conversation in a big way. The near north that we used to just singularly fear as a source of only danger and threat has become the economic livelihood that we want to cultivate and curate in order to continue to enjoy our standard of living. You've got new industries like tourism and education that have become massive. And aviation is the core trunk through which these industries are able to occur. But at the same time, of course, there's the mining boom.
China's explosive growth consumed vast quantities of Australia. By 2005, the resources boom was transforming the working lives of thousands and Australia's entire economy. The price of Australia's coal, minerals and gas went through the roof. Workers began to commute to vast, remote mines. A new kind of commercial flyer took off.
I fly to work on a charter flight. It's approximately, from what I know, about 2,000 k's from home.
Across Australia's history, we've had itinerant workers forever. You know, you think of the swagman. My father worked for an oil company. He would have been called an itinerant worker.
I think the biggest misconception is we're highly paid deadbeats. I know we're highly paid, but a lot of us are highly educated. There's engineers, there's some very knowledgeable people on site.
In modern Australia, aviation completely reworks our relationship with distance and, as an enormous country, our relationship internally with ourselves, but also our relationship with the rest of the world. We know that if that tap gets turned off overnight, if that line is severed, then you've got core Australian industries. That's education, that's tourism and travel, just seize up overnight. And that's very new.
A travel ban will be placed on all non-residents, non-Australian citizens coming to Australia.
I was in Sun Valley skiing in Utah, you know, with my kids and my dad, and we would watch the news and we knew that there was a virus, but we at first thought it was in China because that's where it outbroke. No one knew how radically things were going to change.
Aviation is a perfect tool, perfect vehicle to get people travelling around the world. And, you know, the virus loves people and houses itself in people, and planes fly people around. So it was a perfect vehicle to get the virus spreading.
Aeroplanes carried passengers infected with COVID-19 to almost every nation on Earth. Aviation would be the first industry to face the economic storm that followed.
So I flew right up until the end. We sort of landed into Sydney and you'd land and there'd be just a sea of people at the customs hall, all in masks, and it just felt quite empty and sad, a bit of disbelief. And I guess the unknown, like I still have people ask me, when are you going back to work? And I honestly do not have an answer for that.
It's 7 a.m, rush hour at Sydney Airport. Over 1,000 flights a day once took off or landed here. The COVID-19 pandemic cut the air bridges that link Australians to each other and the world. They're coming back, slowly. But what will be the virus's lasting effect on our love affair with flight?
Australians' resilience in the face of the pandemic, the desire of Australians to connect with people who are different from themselves, or even people who are close to them who are somewhere else in the world, that's going to continue. Their desire to fly, on the other hand, is another question.
Grounded by the virus, Australians turned to digital connections and rediscovered their local neighbourhoods. Fear of the coronavirus decimated aviation and the global economy,
and threatened Australians' 100-year-old desire to fly.
I think there is a part of the Australian psyche that is an explorer, that is an adventurer, that is connected to relatives from overseas. So I think some of the fears we have are short-term, and I think that our overarching desire to connect with others will triumph.
I always felt lucky and blessed with my job, but I can honestly say that I'm going to have a deeper appreciation for that global citizenship that I have, being a flight attendant. Yeah, I think maybe crew will go back bouncing to work with a happy smile on their face, thinking, wow, you know, go to San Fran for breakfast tomorrow.
I've come to the end of my 100-year journey.
What's happened in the air has shaped Australia on the ground. Danger, injustice, and disease have made this a turbulent history. But flying has introduced speed, glamour, and opportunity to Australian life. It's brought people together across this vast continent and the globe. As aviation and Australia adapt to a fast-changing world, we continue to look to the skies for a glimpse of the future.